Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Just me back again today, but a lot of exciting stuff going on in this sort of cloud native world. We talk a lot about what's going on around cloud native, around Kubernetes, around the things that are happening in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And today, with KubeCon coming up here in a couple of weeks, we're very, very excited to have Joseph Jacks on with us. JJ, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
You are the sort of creator of the KubeCon event. You created it and sort of fostered it. We're now moving into year 2. You created it back when you and Patrick Riley were doing things at Kismatic. Eventually, Kismatic got bought by Apprenda, and you're overrunning Kubernetes activities over there. But with this thing coming up on year 2, give us a sort of state of the union of KubeCon and a little bit of where you see Kubernetes these days.
Wow, that is a big question.
All right, start with KubeCon then. Just start with the basics.
Sure, no problem. It's been absolutely amazing how fast this community has grown, and I don't really have much to benchmark it against. I mean, I kind of say that a lot, like, oh, it's just amazing and it's growing fast. I haven't been involved in open source my whole career. My first sort of exposure to open source software in sort of a high growth way was at a company called Talend. Kind of a French open source middleware company, a really awesome company. And they were sort of setting out to build the first kind of really useful enterprise ETL product. And they open sourced it and ended up, building a lot of momentum and tons of users. They were sort of competing with companies like Informatica and IBM DataStage, Ab Initio, and they had a couple million users. And the company behind that project ended up building commercial tools and just massive growth. They just went IPO recently. So just working inside of that company at a fairly early stage and kind of for a couple of years seeing the growth was the only benchmark I have to this.
Yep.
And I can say that with Kubernetes, it's just so much higher velocity and just a much larger ecosystem across different industries and commercial participants than I've seen with specifically Talend, but just having kind of developed an affinity for open source over the years. So it's just phenomenal, and I'm just super honored to have been involved really early on in the project, as you say, with KubeCon and just kind of helping in my own little way. But KubeCon has kind of taken me by surprise. I think by a lot of people by surprise. We really actually thought originally it was just going to be a big meetup, like a sort of an oversized 150, 200 person meetup,
right.
And ended up seeing almost 600 people at the first one. We had about 560 or so people attend KubeCon San Francisco in November of last year. And then we did a follow-up in Europe and London of this year, which was just roughly the same size, slightly smaller, but well north of 500 people. And we're going to double that this year, which is our North American follow-up happening in Seattle in a couple weeks now, or a few weeks.
Right.
So It's pretty exciting. We'll have more than 1,000 people there. We sold out about a week ago, so that's
cool.
Pretty good indication of some of the activity. Just for reference, in case a lot of people don't know, usually events of this size, sort of more than 500-600 people, sell like 90% or so of the tickets within the 2 to 3 weeks preceding the event. So the fact that we sold out, a week ago, actually shows that we probably could have had a much larger event, but it just shows that there's just tons of demand. So it's pretty exciting from that standpoint.
Yeah. So I'll give you my perspective on the Kubernetes stuff, and you can kind of tell me where you're seeing differences or where you're seeing similarities. I think there was when it sort of Kubernetes, the project first got announced. I think there was a certain amount of excitement because you didn't have, so you had this sort of cloud technology married with kind of the hype of containers. So it was like, okay, it seems like the right place at the right time, but you had a certain amount of cautiousness because it was Google, and people aren't exactly sure, how to react to Google, right? There's a part of it that, the community looks at Google and goes, unbelievable knowledge and talent and so forth. And then there's the flip side of it, which goes, I used to have Google Reader and I used to have, this Google Plus, and, I don't know if they're going to stay committed to it. And what's been interesting to me is, Google has sort of, to a certain extent, they've stayed in the background. I don't want to say they haven't participated, because obviously they're massive contributors and massively, helping what's going on. But they've taken, a role that feels sort of appropriate for the community, and it's allowed a lot of different companies, a lot of different individual contributors, end customers to participate. I mean, is that what you see in the community? Like, the community doesn't feel like it feels like one that isn't acrimonious. It doesn't have a lot of fights within it. It feels like, it's got a major contributor, but then a lot of other contributors, a lot of openness. Is that what you see in the community as well?
I think so. I think that's a good way to put it. I mean, Google has recognized the importance of not sort of being a benevolent dictator for the project. And to that extent, they've actually been the sort of champions behind this idea of a leadership or an elders council of sort of people appointed across the community, not exclusively within Google, to sort of resolve technical disputes and engineering disputes that might not necessarily disputes or arguments, but points of conflict around architectural directions and different things like that. And in that way, I think they've kind of directly acknowledged that Kubernetes needs to have a highly distributed and decentralized governance model. So I mean, I think that was kind of one of the early design points of the project, was to focus on community and make sure that the community grew, out of this decentralized model, but also that Google would sort of play a part and not the part in making sure the project was successful.
Right.
So I definitely see that, and there's I think there's one thing that we can correlate with sort of lots of perhaps contention and maybe not infighting, but politics, maybe more than anything else, which I think is harped on quite a bit, but it's worth bringing up here since you brought it up, is I think open source, and I'm not going to mention any specific open source projects here, but open source projects that have a single vendor backing them fundamentally throughout their evolution, where those open source projects are created by a single vendor and owned essentially outright in terms of IP and trademark and governance model and foundational aspects throughout the life of those projects, and where there's essentially one, very large, dominant, outsized contributor as well. I think that sort of formula encourages lots of potential conflict, especially as an open source project starts to get quite a lot of industry and ecosystem momentum.
Yep.
So Kubernetes really stands out in that way, and I think that's one of the main contributors that has caused it to be so successful. Yeah.
I think the way I explain it sometimes to some people is, that there's a difference in a project when its goal seems to feel like it's trying to replace something, so, this open project is going to replace this commercial thing, right? So the media likes to write it as the headline of, such and such kills such and such. And there's a difference between that and kind of a project in a leadership group that says, hey, we're trying to grow this pie. Like that's kind of the ultimate goal. And it feels a little bit like that's sort of where this is.
Yeah. That's a really good way to put it. I mean, having said that, I don't think that there are any inherently wrong or broken ways inherent in the other approach, where it's like a single vendor, a single governance model, a single sort of overriding contributor, typically from that vendor. In fact, the example I cited earlier, Talend, had like pretty much all of that.
Yeah.
It was like basically no other companies contributing to the Talend like ETL connector tool base, and they were able to pull off an IPO, and I think they're growing fairly successfully now, even into that. But like the point is, I think where you start to actually have a real concern and interest in very long-term, perhaps multi-decade industry impact, you need to have a focus for all the other dimensions that we were talking about in terms of being decentralized and much more inclusive to wider industry participation.
Right. So you and I met, or at least we met online, probably about 18 months ago. Kismatic, I don't even think had launched yet. And for the most part, you guys were doing a lot of POCs. It was, I think the way that you explained it to me was, it's a lot of education. It's teaching people everything from, how to use Docker to, what is this Kubernetes thing and concepts. And, and now we're 18 months later and we're seeing, very big name companies, names that people know. You'll see them at the event, but you can see them at even vendor events, saying, hey, look, we run something in production. Right.
Yep.
And like, what have you seen from your perspective? Like what's changed that's a pretty steep ramp, within 18 months to go from like, teach me the basics to I'm going to trust to put things into production. What's been going on? What's been driving that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's just really hard to put a finger on exactly what's driving it. I think it's a confluence of things. But to your point, like early on when Kubernetes was just a couple months old when we got started and really supporting customers and working with companies, nobody really knew what it was. So that was like the only thing we could be doing fundamentally was just educating people, right, and telling them like what this interesting new distributed systems framework or toolkit was all about for containers and for Docker. Whereas now, as you're saying, there's just so many companies using this project in production, and many others too. I don't think it's just exclusive to Kubernetes. There's projects that are written in Go that solve a lot of the critical problems people are facing when they're running sort of microservices style distributed systems in larger scale, more demanding environments, and they need a way to sort of solve these problems of reliability and discovery and networking in a sane way. So instead of writing their own frameworks and building their own schedulers or their own PASs or these different things, they end up actually using things off the shelf. And I think we've seen a fair amount of consolidation. One driver can be that we've seen a fair amount of consolidation over the last 18 to 24 months in these specific areas. One of the interesting patterns that I've actually noticed, which is just one small pattern, but I'll just take out an example so I don't talk in hieroglyphics for this whole interview, is a lot of people used Fleet early on. So CoreOS's Fleet, which is a sort of like low-level unit file method for bootstrapping processes across a cluster of hosts.
Yep.
And it actually served its purpose for quite a number of things. But these were some pretty forward-thinking companies that already appreciated the value of running their distributed systems in an automated way using a scheduler and using something like Fleet.
Yep.
But over time, they moved over to Kubernetes because they just realized that they needed a lot more, and they had a lot of abstractions missing from Fleet, and they ended up writing a lot of custom homegrown software to solve for that. And there's lots of other companies who, as you were saying, just sort of started using containers, and they're like, wow, this is an awesome, packaging mechanism. It's giving us some really smart ways to manage resource utilization and place our code in any kind of environment and expect the same sort of predictable result, makes our engineers more efficient and so on. And, we actually are stumbling upon these problems that start to persist when you run things, even in dev test, and you have to sort of start to glue things together. And so those companies start to look at Kubernetes and they start to try and learn about it and understand it. And I think that's another sort of entry point. There's also a wide range of companies that are sort of by default starting to realize that in order to build, large scale, we like to call them cloud native applications, they need to use some specific technologies to achieve those end results, which are, typically container-based packaging methodologies. They need to figure out how to reduce or eliminate operational overhead within their existing organizations. So they sort of try and find an automated software scheduling system that allows them to run these applications on a cluster of machines or a public-private cloud. in order to take advantage of utilization efficiencies. They need to figure out how to network these services together so that they can actually be partitioned effectively and actually communicate with each other. So service discovery or service-to-service communication starts to become important. There's different evolutions in that particular area that are going on. So I think sort of the greenfield, people migrating off of prior systems, and the people who are kind of replacing their preconceived notions of what scale looks like with the modern world. Those are all entry points into using Kubernetes. And I think just a bunch of network effects around contribution, around the community, as we've been talking about, around how the project has matured to a point well beyond production readiness, that companies are really betting on it. And we're actually going to be open sourcing some pretty exciting data pretty soon around some of the statistics we have around companies that are using Kubernetes in production. And you may or may not know, we've been collaborating with companies in the industry, including Red Hat and Google and others, on this. And it's super, super exciting to see. I mean, it's just a huge number. I mean, it's a huge number of companies actually running Kubernetes in production now. And the product is like just a little over 2 years old. Yeah. And it's only a year past being a production ready sort of project, which is really, really impressive. I mean, you just have to compare that to Spark or OpenStack or even Hadoop, some of the most successful projects ever. And I don't think we've seen that level of a production adoption in such a short period of time in the history of open source software, which is really remarkable. I mean, we have to sort of consider just open source software, period. I mean, even if you consider the first few years of Linux, right? Like it's sort of a outlier thing. All the Sun Solaris people were like, "What's this Linux thing?"
Right. Yeah, I was gonna ask you that, because if you follow your Twitter account at all, you're always sort of finding or kind of uncovering, okay, so and so this company is starting to run this, and or you'll sort of throw out some numbers or teasers about, hey, you're going to be surprised. So I was gonna ask you for your deep dark secrets about how you guys were tracking all that, but it's good to know that it's all going to be made public here sooner or later. So that's cool.
It's just out there. It's just out there on the internet, and you talk to people, and you go to meetups, and you there's the customer pipeline and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, we're excited to get it out there. Because it is kind of a secret, to your point. A lot of people just sort of think there's a lot of buzz and hype in this space. And I think to a certain extent that's true, right? Like there is a lot of buzz and hype and inflated expectations kind of being thrown out there. But, people are really excited about this stuff.
Yeah, and it's a different mix of dynamics these days. I mean, it's not all the companies that are actively participating are public companies. So you've got a level of that. You've got, end users who are doing things that they've never really done before. They're not only contributing software, but you see them, keynoting events, and sometimes they're using it as a recruiting opportunity. And I mean, they're all fighting for engineering talent. And I mean, so you have a lot of different things. And I mean, one of the things that I kind of track, at least on the back of a napkin, is, who was speaking at so-and-so's event, and how much are they, and then you'll see them speaking at another event, and you'll go, okay, should I read into that as trying to find engineering talent, or should I read into that as they were dissatisfied with the previous, technology, and so they moved on to something else? And, so there's a lot of kind of interesting, just puzzle pieces, like you said, to put together. Yep. A lot of what's going on in Kubernetes, very positive. Like you said, the events are up, usage is up. But there's still aspects of it, obviously, that need evolution. There's feedback that people give that's not always rosy. One of those being, in certain extents, just hard to get running. It's like once it gets running, great. Day 178, great. But day one, what are you seeing in that space? I mean, I know there's lots of different efforts. Everybody's got how do I get this up with one command? And Kelsey's taken a completely different approach of, trying to show you, what goes on under the covers. And I assume he's trying to do that so that you eventually appreciate like what happens when it gets automated. But what other areas do you still see where, like, hey, there's some ways to go here before, it'll not before it becomes where it needs to become, but where you're seeing people push back and give feedback that it needs improvement?
Yeah, I still think that the sort of day zero, day one, however you look at it, experience still needs a lot of refinement and improvement. And I think one of the big compelling drivers, frankly, we cross-pollinate from other communities all the time and vice versa, is at the last DockerCon when Docker Swarm was announced to be built into the Docker engine with SwarmKit. Within a couple commands where you've got swarm init, swarm join, and you've got a clusterized, within a couple of these really simple to learn and understand commands, you can have a clusterized set of Docker hosts. That sort of was the compelling event, if you will, for the Kubernetes community to really galvanize around. Okay, how do we actually get a really simple, a really dead simple installation experience going? So there's kubeadmin or kubeadm, which is a new effort that kicked off a couple months ago from folks at Google and Weaveworks, and that's actually now been built into the project as of 1.4, which landed a couple weeks back, which is pretty exciting. It's still fairly early days, but now you can pretty much get a Kubernetes cluster up and running within a few commands in a very short period of time. In 1.5, which should be landing in early December, kubeadm should be evolving pretty heavily. But I think that overall, there's a couple problems with getting Kubernetes up and running and getting it up and running quickly. One is actually a technical problem, which is the system itself is fairly complex, and to sort of understand all the different components and deploy them in the right order and understand the dependencies and which systems actually do what. There's a fair bit of cognitive there's a cognitive cliff there.
Yep.
But there's lots of things that abstract that and simplify it, which kind of segues nicely into the second big problem, which is more of a sort of problem of optionality, where there are just so many ways of going about that end result of, I just want a Kubernetes cluster that's reliable and running on a set of infrastructure somewhere. There are literally 50 different options, right?
Right.
And or more, 50 at least that I've been able to track. And for the community to sort of have that many options is very concerning, because it shows that there isn't a sort of a common consensus across the community around what should be the proper and right way of doing things. And kubeadm is a great step in that direction. But people have been have been struggling with this and discussing ways to sort of solve this problem for probably north of a year now, pretty much ever since Kubernetes 1.0 came out.
Right.
And so I think those are the two big ones. The reason I have no problem talking about this is I truly think that these two problems, right? Like the technology problem itself, where Kubernetes is inherently a fairly complex system, and then the optionality problem. I think both of those are fairly solvable, and within a short period of time, we're going to start to see dramatic simplification and improvement and solutions across both of those areas. And by short period of time, I literally mean months, maybe a quarter or two or less of time. And so I think that I say that confidently because I know how fast this community moves and how fast people actually jump on things and solve problems. And we're contributing to solving a lot of those problems here at Apprenda. I know Red Hat's been doing a lot of awesome work. There's just so many great, brilliant people that are coming together across the community, and to think that these things are just going to persist past a few months is not realistic. But beyond that, there's also lots of other issues with a fast growing open source project that happens to be fairly complex. I think there's just lots of new things that people want to build into Kubernetes natively, and there's increasingly more and more pushback around that because people want to see a set of standard interfaces defined, and where the sort of surface area becomes too complex, you end up having this big, Frankenstein system that nobody wants, right? So today we have a super powerful set of abstractions that allow you to run, very, very reliable and diverse distributed systems. There's a large number of things people want to add in. So I think as the surface area sort of gets locked down, and as Bob Wise and others have said in the community, sort of as we start to make Kubernetes more boring and more stable, the opportunity to extend it and add in ecosystem components through things like third-party resources or through federated API servers or other things like extension mechanisms becomes greater, and we can actually solve some really interesting problems on the periphery as opposed to building them upstream.
Right. Yeah, and I think I think what you pointed out is exactly right, and to a certain extent, some of those complexity problems, for folks that are willing to do it, and there obviously is a community of people that want to do that. Like some of those are even sort of solvable today. I mean, there are, you can go to a number of the public cloud providers, and there is a sort of hosted managed Kubernetes service, like GKE.
Exactly.
Obviously there's a number of commercial vendors, ourselves both being biased towards that, who are pretty good at getting these things up and running. And but yeah, you're right. As a community, you do have to find that right balance between I want to make the thing powerful, and I want to make it, there's a different magic to solving for day zero versus day whatever. But I'm interested, so I'm going to wrap this up with one last question.
Yep, sure.
So recently there was a project that was announced. I want to say it was at like Container Day. It was up in Toronto, and I think maybe the Linux Foundation. But it was basically the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and the Kubernetes folks are going to take or going to work with the Cloud Foundry Foundation and take some of their service broker technology. And you were just talking a second ago about places where third parties can begin to sort of integrate around that at a 10,000 foot level. Give folks some sense of what you see in terms of where SIs are going to start to integrate things, provide value, like people outside of the core sort of guts technology community are going to start to provide value around all this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's kind of two questions, because there is the service catalog, service broker effort, which is basically taking the some of the inspirations anyway from the Cloud Foundry service broker API and actually using that as the design basis for a service catalog, service broker in Kubernetes itself, which is an active development effort. And as you're saying, sort of collaboratively between CF Foundation and CNCF, and of course the Kubernetes community. And so we're involved in that from a Prenda's perspective. We see huge value there as a platform, as a service vendor. I know Red Hat's heavily contributing and driving that. From OpenShift's standpoint, you guys have lots of opinions there. So I think that's really awesome to see that effort kick off. The SI question, I think, is somewhat orthogonal to that, but it's similar. This is actually an area where I think we're going to see a massive explosion in contributions. So we've already started to see this a little bit. One of the things that surprised me the most, as an example, is TIBCO coming out and actually building a product based on packaging there. And I actually worked at TIBCO, so I can speak fairly intimately about this. They have a wide range of middleware integration products for doing application integration and messaging for high performance enterprise applications and data processing. And they've been selling proprietary software for quite a long time, but they've wanted to sort of adopt these new models of using microservices patterns in the sort of old world of SOAP and XML based SOA for quite a while. So when Docker and Kubernetes started to grow and become really popular systems, they just jumped onto that, and as an SI, as a very large, multi-billion-dollar software company that was privatized recently, but there's still pretty large force in that industry. To see them basically go out and package a first-class abstraction between running their integration artifacts for doing SOA and data transfer between applications on Kubernetes is pretty awesome. And I think that's just one sort of similar industry example. We're probably going to see lots of others where you'll actually have packaged software vendors like SAP or Oracle, IBM, many others come out and actually start to run their packaged software applications and containers on Kubernetes just to make management upgrades and extensibility of those packaged software products that they sell for many millions of dollars in customized ways to their vendor to their customers to make that whole process easier. We've already started to see that with just the smaller sort of startup vendor ecosystem where they're selling hosted and on-premise versions of their software, and the management complexity and the versioning dependencies that come into play there there's a wide range of problems. So not only on the industry side, where we're seeing big banks and retail and insurance and pharmaceutical and entertainment, all this sort of industry end users using Kubernetes and Docker and these new technologies, but also on the vendor side, I think we're going to see a huge rise in adoption from software vendors for those reasons. But yeah, I'm pretty excited about all these developments. And thanks again for having me on, Brian.
Yeah, very cool. So let me go ahead and wrap that up. I know you're short on time. Real quick, where can folks find you on Twitter if they want to follow up with you?
I'm on Twitter at AsyncIO. Okay. So it's ASYNCHIO. And that's pretty much my go-to source. You can find me like on LinkedIn and other places, but I'm very active on Twitter. I love Twitter.
Very cool. All right, folks. Thank you very much, Joseph, for the time. Sure. And as always, we will hopefully see you at KubeCon. And folks, we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.